that is to say economic improvements, may well lead to higher, not lower, levels of crime. And similarly, economic declines may not generate crime increases, but may generate crime declines. We'll talk about that reasoning in a moment. The reasoning behind that rather complex relationship is I think, quite plausible. The evidence for it, however, is thin. One of the reasons that past research on economic conditions and crime has led to mixed results and has been somewhat inconclusive has been because most of that research done by criminologists, but also economists and sociologists, has focused on a single indicator of economic conditions, the unemployment rate. And for a variety of reasons, some of which I'll elaborate on in a few moments, the unemployment rate is not, in my view, the preferred indicator of economic conditions for purposes of understanding any impact on crime rates. It's a very narrow indicator. As many of you may know, to be officially unemployed in the United States, you have to be in the labor market. And you have to have been searching for work during the previous 6 weeks. If you don't meet those conditions, then you're not officially unemployed. You're out of the labor market. Now, you may well be jobless, but you're not counted as part of the official unemployment statistics. It's a relatively narrow measure in that sense. It's narrow, too, in that it measures only a single aspect of economic circumstances, employment. And I think, and secondly, unemployment rates tend to be lagging indicators of economic change. We entered the current recession prior to the huge increase in unemployment that we've seen over the last now 9 months to a year. And unemployment rates will remain relatively high even after this recession ends, assuming that it does. Unemployment rates tend to lag other economic indicators, and from my point of view, it's preferable for purposes of understanding the connection between unemployment and crime, not to mention for purposes of doing some forecasting of future crime, to use leading indicators, economic indicators, as opposed to lagging ones. But the most important reason that the unemployment rate, I don't have it here, is less preferred as an indicator of economic change for understanding crime rate changes, and indeed much else, is that it doesn't tell us anything about persons' perceptions of their own economic circumstances or of general economic conditions. And with respect to criminal behavior, perceptions matter. There is, I should say, a much better economic indicator, index of consumer sentiment and related indicators that tell us something much more directly about how people perceive their economic circumstances both now and what they expect they're going to be in the near future. And for that reason alone, such an indicator, it seems to me, is to be preferred over the unemployment rate taken by itself. In more recent research, I think we've turned a corner on these mixed results and correspondingly mixed conclusions about the relationship between the economy and crime. In recent research, broader economic indicators, such as gross domestic product per capita, appear to be reliably related to changes over time in economic conditions. What GDP measures is overall economic output. And if GDP is increasing over time, that means that overall economic growth is increasing over time. And what the Argonauts and Defina paper showed, I think quite convincingly, is that during periods of economic growth in the US, we've seen declines in crime. During periods of economic stagnation, when GDP per capita was flat or even declining, we've seen crime increases. No better example is during the period of the 1990s. the single longest peacetime economic expansion in our history and a period of very dramatic crime declines in the U.S. And as I mentioned, crime trends also appear to be related in my own work to subjective economic indicators, and the indicator of greatest interest there is the index of consumer sentiment. What happens is continuous surveys are made of the adult population, and people are asked about their current economic circumstances, whether they're relatively favorable, whether they're not. They're asked how their current circumstances compare to where they were a year before, and they're asked whether they think their current economic circumstances are going to improve. This turns out to be a very reliable measure of economic change. It's correlated with other indicators of economic conditions, and in contrast to the unemployment rate in particular, it's a leading economic indicator. In fact, the index of consumer expectations, which is a subcomponent of the consumer sentiment index, is one of the nation's leading economic indicators. It tends to predict future changes in GDP, future changes in inflation, and future changes in unemployment. So I like this measure because it captures people's perceptions of their economic circumstances. It's a leading indicator, and it's related to a variety of other economic indicators. That is to say, it contains information on a wide range of economic conditions. What this recent research shows pretty consistently is that during periods of economic downturn, crime rates tend to increase. Let's take robbery, for example. Here are robbery rates in the United States over the last half century, thereabouts, from 1960 through 2008. What do we see? We see a huge run-up in crime beginning in the mid-60s and then with some year-to-year fluctuation, peaking in the mid-70s, first and major peak right around 1980. We see a decline and then another upward movement in robbery rates, peaking again in the early 90s, and then we see that this truly historic crime decline in the U.S. That I mentioned earlier, and that flattened out by the end of the century. Since 2000, generally speaking, robbery and robbery is an example of a whole set of crimes that behave pretty much like this one.